I remember the first time I realized something about him was different for me. It wasn't a sudden spark or a dramatic revelation. It was slow, quiet, and steady, like water dripping against stone until the shape finally changes. My cousin had always been close to me. From the time we were kids, we were inseparable at family gatherings, always finding reasons to sit next to each other, always laughing at jokes nobody else seemed to understand. To everyone else, we were just cousins, just boys who grew up side by side. But to me, he became something else, something I couldn't name back then, something I was too afraid to even think about. He was the one person who could make me feel alive and guilty at the very same time. I knew it was wrong to think of him that way, or at least that's what the world would say. But desire doesn't listen to rules, and the heart doesn't ask for permission before it beats faster. When I looked back at those moments, the memories seemed ordinary on the surface, playing basketball in the yard, sitting shoulder to shoulder on the couch, brushing against each other as though by accident. Yet each tiny moment carried weight, a secret meaning only I could feel. I remember one summer night more vividly than the rest. We had spent the whole day with the family, swimming, eating, joking around, and when everyone else went to sleep, we ended up sitting on the porch. The night was quiet, the air smelled like grass, and for the first time in my life I noticed how close he was sitting to me. Our knees touched, and he didn't move away. My chest tightened, my throat felt dry, and I couldn't bring myself to shift even an inch. It was nothing, just knees brushing, but to me, it was everything that he wasn't just another boy to me. He was the boy I wasn't allowed to want. That was what made every glance, every laugh, every little smile so dangerous and so intoxicating. I told myself it was nothing, that it was just in my head, but deep down, I knew I couldn't lie forever. And then there were the times when he looked at me a little too long, when his eyes lingered in a way that made me wonder if he felt it too. He always brushed it off with his usual smirk, his easy way of turning everything into a joke, but I could feel the crack in the surface, the place where something unspoken lived. Inside, I carried a war. Part of me wanted to run, to bury the feelings, to pretend they never existed. Another part of me burned with a longing so strong it scared me. What if he never thought of me the same way? What if I was disgusting for even dreaming of it? I hated myself some nights, lying awake in bed replaying the way his laugh made me feel warm, or how his hand on my shoulder sent shivers down my spine. I would curse my heart, beg myself to stop, but the harder I tried, the deeper I fell. There was one moment that marked the beginning of everything, even though I didn't realize it at the time. We were watching a movie together in his room, the kind of night that seemed harmless. The lights were dim, the sound of the TV filled the silence, and we sat so close that our arms rested against each other. I could barely focus on the movie, all I could think about was the warmth of his skin against mine. I thought about moving, creating space, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't listen to my mind. He shifted slightly, leaned back, and for a second, his head rested against my shoulder. My whole body froze, my heart pounded so loud I was sure he could hear it. I didn't move, afraid of breaking the moment, afraid of wanting it too much that I lay awake for hours that night after leaving his room. I replayed the weight of his head against my shoulder, the way he seemed comfortable there, the way I felt like I had touched something sacred and forbidden. My thoughts raced with questions I couldn't answer. Did he mean anything by it? Was it just casual, meaningless, something cousins do without thinking? Or was there something hidden beneath the surface, something he wouldn't admit out loud either? The questions haunted me, and the not knowing became a fire that consumed me quietly every day. The hardest part was pretending. Pretending I was fine, pretending nothing was happening inside me, pretending that every time our eyes met, it didn't feel like my chest was splitting open. Around the family, everything looked normal. To everyone else, we were just boys being boys, just cousins with a strong bond. But I knew. I felt it in every nerve, in every heartbeat. Something was changing, something was building between us, and no matter how much I told myself to let it go, the truth was I didn't want to. I wanted to feel more, even if it meant carrying guilt, even if it meant risking everything. The secret grew in silence, in small moments nobody else would ever notice. His laugh echoing in my chest. His smile making the world blur around me. The way he leaned too close when he spoke, lowering his voice as if his words belonged only to me. It was dangerous, it was wrong, and yet it was the only thing that made me feel alive. I didn't know how much longer I could keep it buried inside. And deep down, I feared that one day, something would break, something would spill out, and once it did, nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed seemed normal to everyone else, but inside me, everything had changed. It was as if that one moment, his head resting on my shoulder, had broken something I'd tried so hard to keep sealed. Now, every glance, every touch, every word carried a new weight. I noticed things about him I had ignored before, or maybe I just hadn't let myself see. The curve of his smile, the way his eyes softened when he was tired, the way his voice dropped lower when he was serious. All of it pulled me in like gravity, and no matter how hard I tried to resist, I kept falling deeper. It was torture and bliss wrapped together, because while I lived in fear of being discovered, I also couldn't deny the way it made me feel alive. He had always been playful, the kind of guy who knew how to get under my skin in small, teasing ways. But now, those playful moments felt sharper, heavier, almost dangerous. When he shoved me jokingly or ruffled my hair, I felt it linger longer than it should. When he looked at me and grinned after making a sarcastic comment, I felt something stir inside me that was stronger than laughter. It became a secret language, one I wasn't sure he even realized he was speaking, but it was there. And I couldn't stop reading into it. One evening, we sat outside while the rest of the family was busy indoors. The sky was turning dark, that in-between time when the world feels softer, quieter. He leaned back against the wall, his arms crossed, his eyes following the fading light. I sat beside him, pretending to be just as calm, but inside my chest was pounding. Then he asked, out of nowhere, if I ever felt like no one really understood me. It was such a simple question, but coming from him, it felt like he had reached into me and pulled out something I never thought he'd see. I wanted to lie, to brush it off with some casual answer, but the way he looked at me made me stop. His eyes were searching, almost vulnerable, like he needed me to be honest. So I told him yes. I told him there were things I never felt I could say, feelings I had to keep locked away. That he nodded slowly, staring down at his hands, and whispered that he felt the same sometimes. The air between us grew heavier, charged with something unspoken. He didn't go into details, didn't say what he meant exactly, but the way his voice cracked at the end made me wonder if his secrets were closer to mine than I dared believe. That single moment of honesty felt more intimate than any physical touch we had shared, because it wasn't just about closeness, it was about trust. After that, he started opening up more, in small, careful doses. He would share pieces of himself late at night when the world was quiet, when no one else could hear. He told me about feeling trapped by expectations, about people always assuming they knew who he was, what he wanted, what his future would look like. He laughed it off sometimes, pretending it wasn't serious, but I could see the cracks behind his smile. He wanted more than the role everyone else had written for him. And in those conversations, I saw the side of him nobody else saw, the side that wasn't just confident and playful, but fragile and searching, that I wanted to reach out, to tell him he wasn't alone, to confess the truth that sat like a stone in my chest. But fear kept my lips sealed. I told myself it would ruin everything, that once the words left my mouth, there would be no taking them back. So instead, I listened. I let him talk, I let him share his loneliness, and I held on to every word like it was a gift. And even though I didn't confess, I hoped that somehow he could feel it in the way I stayed, in the way I looked at him like he was the only thing that mattered in that moment, but it wasn't just the words that made my heart race. It was the way he looked at me sometimes, the way his eyes lingered a second too long, the way his laughter would fade into silence when we locked eyes. He had a habit of pushing boundaries, brushing his hand against mine, sitting closer than necessary, finding excuses to touch me in ways that could be passed off as casual but felt deliberate to me. I told myself not to read too much into it, that maybe this was just how he was. But deep down, I knew. I knew there was something there, something he was testing, something he was daring me to acknowledge. The more he did it, the harder it became to resist. My chest felt tight whenever he leaned too close, my breath quickened whenever his shoulder pressed against mine. I started craving those moments, waiting for them, even though they left me torn between guilt and desire. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff, terrified of the fall but unable to step back. Then came the night that changed everything for me. We had been sitting in his room again, just talking, the way we always did when the world outside felt too heavy. He was lying back on the bed, and I was sitting on the floor, leaning against the frame. We were close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body radiating toward me. He said something funny, and I laughed, turning my head to look at him. That's when I saw it. The way he was staring at me, his expression softer than I had ever seen. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us thickened, heavy with something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. My chest pounded, my throat tightened, and I felt frozen in place. He smirked faintly, as though trying to cover it up, but the look in his eyes betrayed him. It wasn't just playfulness. It was something deeper, something forbidden, something that made my skin burn and my heart ache all at once. And in that silence, I realized the line between us wasn't as solid as I thought. It was fragile, trembling, waiting to be crossed. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the way he looked at me, the softness in his eyes, the closeness of his body. I wanted to believe it meant something, that I wasn't imagining it, that he felt the same pull I did. But even as hope sparked inside me, fear pressed against it. Because if I was right, everything was about to get far more complicated than I ever imagined. The silence between us grew louder with each passing day, not the kind of silence that comes from having nothing to say, but the kind that hums with tension, with unspoken words neither of us dared to release. Every time we were alone together, I felt it hanging in the air, pressing against us like an invisible wall that was about to crack. I tried to ignore it, to push it aside, but it was impossible. My cousin had become the center of my thoughts, the reason my chest ached and my stomach knotted with both excitement and dread. I told myself I could manage it, that I could keep everything locked inside, but the truth was I was losing control of my own restraint. It was late one night when everything finally slipped. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes when everyone else has gone to bed and the world seems to pause. We were in his room again, pretending to watch a movie, but neither of us was paying attention. He kept fidgeting, shifting his weight, glancing at me and then looking away quickly as if caught. I could feel his restlessness, the way his energy filled the space, and it made my own pulse race faster. Then, out of nowhere, he asked if I had ever thought about what it would be like to do something reckless, something we weren't supposed to. His words were casual, wrapped in a smirk, but his eyes betrayed him. They were sharp, searching, as though he wanted to see my reaction more than hear my answer. That I tried to laugh it off, to play along like it was just another one of his jokes, but my voice came out strained. He didn't let it go. He leaned closer, his arm brushing mine, and whispered that sometimes he wondered what it would be like to cross lines just to see what would happen. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to ask what he meant, but I didn't need to. His eyes said it for him. They lingered on me, flickering between my eyes and my lips, and suddenly the room felt smaller, hotter, like the air had thickened into something we couldn't escape. That I remember my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Every rational thought screamed at me to pull away, to break the tension, to protect the both of us from something we couldn't take back. But I couldn't move. I was trapped between fear and desire, my body frozen as his hand brushed against mine. It wasn't an accident. I knew it, and he knew I knew it. The touch was deliberate, testing, a question wrapped in silence. My fingers trembled, but I didn't pull away. Instead, I let my hand stay there, burning under the weight of his skin. The movie flickered in the background, forgotten, as the world narrowed to just the two of us and the tiny space between our bodies. He leaned in slightly, his shoulder pressing against mine, his breath grazing my cheek. My whole body was on fire, my mind spinning with the reality of what was happening. I wanted to stop him, to protect us from the inevitable disaster that would follow, but the truth was I didn't want to stop him at all. For so long, I had buried these feelings, convinced myself they were mine alone, but here he was, breaking the silence, reaching across the line we both knew existed. That I whispered his name, my voice trembling, not even sure what I wanted to say. Maybe I wanted to warn him, maybe I wanted to give him one last chance to pull back. But instead of moving away, he smiled faintly, a nervous kind of smile I had never seen on him before, and whispered, "It's okay." And then, without waiting for permission, he let his head rest against mine. It wasn't a kiss, not yet, but it was enough to send my body into chaos. His forehead pressed gently against me, his warmth sinking into my skin, his hand still brushing against mine. It was such a small gesture, but it felt monumental. That I don't know how long we sat there like that, breathing the same air, trembling in the same silence. Every second felt like forever, stretched thin with anticipation. My chest rose and fell rapidly, my heart racing as though it was trying to keep up with the storm inside me. I knew what was happening, and I knew it wasn't something I could erase. We had stepped onto forbidden ground, and nothing could make it clean again. Then, like a spark catching fire, it happened. His fingers slid between mine, intertwining, holding me in a way that was both gentle and certain. My body shivered, my throat closed, and for the first time, I let myself squeeze his hand back. It was terrifying, exhilarating, overwhelming, all at once. We didn't need words. That single act said everything. It said he felt it too. It said we weren't imagining it. It said we were in this together, no matter how dangerous it was. When I finally looked at him, his eyes were softer than I had ever seen, filled with something I couldn't mistake. There was no smirk, no playful mask, just raw honesty staring back at me. And in that look, I saw the truth I had been too afraid to believe. He wanted this just as much as I did. That realization shook me to my core. It was both the most beautiful and the most terrifying moment of my life, because from that point forward, there would be no going back. That we didn't speak of it when the night ended. We let go of each other's hands when footsteps echoed in the hall, and by the time morning came, everything on the surface looked normal again. But inside, nothing was normal anymore. Something had been awakened, something that couldn't be buried again. And though neither of us dared to say it out loud, I knew we were standing at the edge of a secret that would consume us both. The days after that night felt like walking through a dream I couldn't escape. Everything looked the same on the outside, family meals, small talk, laughter, but beneath it all, a secret burned between us, alive and untouchable. Every time our eyes met, there was a flicker, a flash of recognition, like we were remembering what we had shared in the quiet darkness. It was no longer something I could brush off as imagination. The truth had revealed itself in the way his fingers had clung to mine, in the way his forehead had rested against me like we belonged together. I carried that moment with me everywhere, and it followed me like a ghost that whispered in every silence that he didn't act like nothing had happened, not exactly. If anything, he leaned into it more. His touches became bolder, his closeness harder to disguise as innocent. Sitting beside me, he would let his leg press against mine and never move away. He would brush his arm across my back in a way that lingered longer than it should. When we talked, his gaze would lock on mine and hold, daring me to look away first. It was reckless, and it left me breathless every time. The more he did it, the harder it became to hide what was happening inside me. The guilt was heavy, but the desire was stronger. One night, the line finally blurred beyond return. The house was asleep again, the world wrapped in silence, and I found myself in his room. He was stretched out on the bed, scrolling on his phone, his expression relaxed in that lazy way of his. When I walked in, he tossed the phone aside and patted the spot beside him. My chest tightened as I sat down, the mattress dipping beneath our weight. At first, we talked the way we always did, casual, teasing, with bursts of laughter that made it feel like nothing could touch us. But slowly, the laughter faded, and the silence between words grew thicker. He shifted closer, his arm brushing mine, then resting against it like it belonged there. I could feel the warmth of his skin seeping into me, making it impossible to think straight. I told myself to move, to put space between us, but my body betrayed me. I stayed, frozen, waiting. He leaned in, lowering his voice until it was barely above a whisper, and asked if I ever thought about what would happen if anyone found out. The question hit me like a stone. My breath caught, my body stiffened, and yet I couldn't lie. I nodded slowly, admitting that I thought about it all the time, that it scared me more than anything. That he smirked, but it wasn't his usual cocky grin. It was softer, tinged with nervousness, as though he wanted me to believe he wasn't afraid. Then he whispered that maybe some things were worth the risk. My heart slammed against my ribs, and before I could even process his words, his hand slid onto mine again. This time, there was no hesitation. His fingers wrapped around mine firmly, holding me as though he never intended to let go. The silence grew unbearable. My chest rose and fell too quickly, and I could feel the heat between us like a current pulling me closer. He leaned in further, so close I could feel his breath against my skin. My head spun, my thoughts scrambled, but the pull was undeniable. I didn't know who moved first, maybe it was both of us, but suddenly our lips brushed, tentative and trembling. It wasn't a kiss at first, just a soft press of skin against skin, but it sent a surge through me so powerful I thought my body might give out. I pulled back instinctively, my eyes wide, my chest heaving, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he reached for me again, steady, certain, as though daring me to deny him. This time, when our lips met, it wasn't hesitant. It was raw, hungry, desperate. The dam we had built inside ourselves cracked wide open, spilling everything we had held back for so long. His hand slid to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, while my own hands clung to him like I was afraid he would vanish. The kiss deepened, fierce and trembling, filled with all the emotions we had never dared to speak. In that moment, the world disappeared. There was no family, no rules, no judgment, just him and me, colliding in a secret we could never undo. When we finally pulled apart, gasping for air, the silence was deafening. His forehead rested against mine, our breaths mingling, our hearts pounding in sync. Neither of us spoke at first, too overwhelmed to break the spell. Then he whispered that he didn't know what this meant, that he had never felt this way before, but he couldn't stop. His voice cracked on the last words, and I realized then that he was just as lost, just as scared, just as consumed as I was. That I wanted to tell him everything, that I had wanted this for years, that I had buried it so deep it had nearly destroyed me, that he was the reason I couldn't sleep at night. But all I could manage was to whisper that I didn't want to stop either. The relief that washed over his face made my chest ache. He pulled me close again, holding me like he was afraid the moment would slip away if he let go. That night changed everything. It wasn't just stolen glances and accidental touches anymore. It was real, undeniable, living between us in every heartbeat. We had crossed the line, and there was no turning back. Every moment after that carried the weight of our secret, the fear of being discovered, and yet also the thrill of knowing we had something that belonged only to us. It was dangerous. It was forbidden. And it was the most powerful thing I had ever felt in my life. The days that followed were filled with a new kind of electricity, a dangerous pulse that ran beneath every interaction. We no longer had to wonder if what we felt was real. Our lips had spoken the truth our mouths couldn't dare to say aloud. Every time I looked at him, I remembered the taste of his kiss, the way his hand had gripped the back of my neck, the way he whispered that he couldn't stop. It haunted me, but it also kept me alive. I walked through the world pretending nothing had changed, but inside, I was burning with the weight of the secret we now shared. What scared me the most wasn't what had happened, but how much I wanted it to happen again, that he wasn't subtle about it anymore, not when we were alone. His touches were more confident, his presence more demanding. When we sat side by side, his hand would rest on my thigh under the cover of a blanket, his thumb drawing slow circles that made my entire body tense with longing. When he laughed at my jokes, his hand lingered on my arm longer than necessary, as though reminding me that his affection wasn't innocent anymore. At night, when the house was quiet, he would find excuses to pull me into his room, closing the door softly behind us, his eyes glowing with the kind of hunger we both tried to keep buried during the day. It was reckless, and I knew it, but I couldn't resist. The risk made it worse. Every moment we stole carried the threat of discovery. At family dinners, I could feel the tension in my chest as I tried to focus on conversation while remembering the way his lips had been pressed against mine just hours before. When relatives laughed and teased us for always being together, I forced myself to smile while fear clawed at me from the inside. Did they suspect? Could they see it in the way I looked at him? My cousin acted natural on the surface, charming and playful, but when his knee brushed against mine under the table, when his gaze lingered a second too long, I knew he was playing with fire, daring the world to notice. One evening, we were outside again, sitting in the fading light. The air was heavy with the scent of summer, thick and still, and the silence between us hummed with tension. He leaned back on the steps, staring at the sky, and said quietly that people would never understand if they knew. His voice was softer than usual, stripped of its usual confidence, and it cut through me like a blade. I asked him if that scared him, and after a long pause, he said it did, but not enough to stop. His hand brushed against mine, then gripped it tightly, as though daring the world to try and pull us apart. That it was in moments like those that the conflict inside me deepened. I wanted him, needed him, more than I had ever needed anything, but the fear of losing everything we knew hung over me constantly. I pictured the look on our family's faces if they ever discovered the truth. I imagined the whispers, the shame, the rejection. Yet every time I considered pulling away, every time I thought about ending it before it went too far, he would draw me back in with a touch, a look, a smile that said he wasn't ready to let go. And neither was I. The secrecy made our connection grow sharper, almost unbearable. We found ways to communicate without words, a secret language of glances and gestures. A squeeze of the hand under the table meant, "I'm here." A smirk from across the room meant, "I'm thinking about us." When no one was looking, his fingers would brush against mine, and that tiny touch would feel more powerful than anything I had ever known. It was intoxicating, this dance we played between the forbidden and the undeniable, but it wasn't all fire and excitement. There were moments when the weight of it pressed so heavily on me I could barely breathe. Lying awake at night, I would replay everything in my head, the kisses, the touches, the whispered words, and feel both bliss and guilt battling inside me. I wondered if he felt the same, if he lay awake too, questioning what we were doing, or if he could compartmentalize it better than I could. I wanted to ask him, to pour out the chaos in my chest, but fear kept me silent. The only time the storm quieted was when I was with him, when his arms wrapped around me and the world disappeared. It wasn't long before people started noticing our closeness in ways that made me uneasy. Relatives would make casual comments about how we were inseparable, how we acted more like best friends than cousins. At first, it was light-hearted, nothing serious, but I could feel the sharp edge of suspicion hidden beneath the laughter. One evening, I overheard a quiet conversation between two family members, their voices low but clear enough for me to catch the words, "too close," and "strange." My blood ran cold. I wanted to confront him about it, to tell him we had to be more careful, but when I looked at him, he only grinned, unconcerned, and brushed it off like it didn't matter. His recklessness terrified me, but it also drew me deeper in. The way he lived without fear, the way he refused to hide his affection when we were alone, it made me want to surrender completely. He told me one night, his voice low and raw, that he didn't care what people thought, that he couldn't pretend he didn't want me. Hearing those words broke something inside me, because they were exactly what I had been too afraid to admit. The love between us wasn't soft or simple. It was sharp, messy, and dangerous, filled with moments of passion that left me shaking and moments of fear that left me breathless. But it was real, more real than anything I had ever known. And even as the walls of secrecy closed tighter around us, even as the risk of discovery grew heavier, I couldn't imagine letting go. Because in his arms, in his kisses, in his whispered confessions, I found something worth every risk, something that made me believe that maybe, just maybe, the fire consuming us was the only truth we had left. The fear of being caught began to follow us like a shadow we couldn't shake. Every time the door creaked open unexpectedly, every time footsteps echoed in the hallway, my heart would leap into my throat. It wasn't just a game anymore, it was dangerous, and the walls around our secret were closing in tighter with every stolen moment. We had built this fragile world for ourselves in silence, but one slip, one careless second, could bring everything crashing down. That weight pressed on me constantly, but no matter how heavy it became, I couldn't stay away from him. He was both the fire and the fuel, the thing that terrified me and the only thing that made me feel alive. It happened one evening when the family was gathered in the living room, laughing over some old stories. He sat across from me, his eyes catching mine every few seconds, holding me with that look that only I knew the meaning of. Nobody else noticed, at least not then, but the air between us was charged in a way that felt impossible to hide. Later that night, when everyone had gone to bed, he pulled me into his room again. His hands were urgent, his voice low, his kisses desperate, as though he was trying to claim every piece of me before the world could take it away. I gave in to him completely, forgetting the danger, until the sound of footsteps outside his door made us both freeze. We pulled apart, breathing hard, our hearts racing. The door didn't open, but the near miss was enough to remind us of how thin the line had become. The fear hit me harder than it did him. He laughed it off afterward, teasing me for being so paranoid, but I could see the crack in his confidence when he thought I wasn't looking. For the first time, I noticed the way his eyes lingered near the door when we were together, the way his body tensed at sudden noises. He wanted me as much as I wanted him, maybe even more, but he was fighting his own war inside, a war between desire and denial. Some nights he would hold me close, whispering that he couldn't stop thinking about me, that he didn't care what anyone thought. But other nights, when fear caught up to him, he would pull back suddenly, saying things he didn't mean, words sharp enough to cut. He told me once in frustration that maybe this was a mistake, that maybe we had gone too far. Hearing those words shattered me, even though a part of me had thought them too. I remember one night vividly. He was pacing in his room, running his hands through his hair, his face twisted with conflict. I sat on the bed, watching him, my chest heavy, my throat tight. He finally stopped, turned to me, and said he was scared, not just of being caught, but of himself, of what this meant for who he was. He said he didn't know how to explain it, that he had always thought of himself as straight, but then I came along and everything he thought he knew about himself collapsed. His voice cracked as he asked me what that made him. I wanted to answer, to comfort him, but I didn't have the words. All I could do was stand and take his hand, pulling him close, whispering that he didn't need a label to explain what we had. That what mattered was the truth between us, not the name anyone else gave it. He buried his face against my shoulder then, his body trembling, and I held him until his breathing slowed, but the tension only grew heavier as the days passed. The family began to notice more than they should have. Small comments turned into curious questions: why we were always together, why we disappeared for long stretches, why we seemed closer than we should be. The whispers that once felt harmless now carried weight, and I could feel eyes following us when we walked into a room. He became more protective, more reckless at the same time. If someone joked about us being inseparable, he would smirk proudly instead of brushing it off. If someone teased him about not having a girlfriend, he would glance at me with a look that made my stomach twist with both pride and fear. It was as if he wanted to challenge the world, to declare something he couldn't say outright. The breaking point came one night when we nearly got caught. We had been together, wrapped in each other, when a knock sounded at the door. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled away from him just as a family member stepped inside. Nothing was seen, but the suspicion in their eyes was undeniable. They lingered a second too long, scanning the room, before saying goodnight and leaving. My entire body shook with fear afterward, but he just laughed, pulling me back into his arms as if nothing had happened. I pushed him away then, my voice sharp, asking if he realized how close we had come to destroying everything. For the first time, anger sparked between us. He accused me of being too afraid, of letting fear control me, while I accused him of being reckless, of not caring about the consequences. The fight left us both raw, our words cutting deep. He stormed out of the room, and I lay awake all night wondering if it was over, if we had finally broken under the pressure, but in the morning, he came back. His eyes were red, his expression tired, but he didn't say a word at first. He just sat beside me, his hand finding mine, squeezing it so tightly I felt the pain. Then he whispered that he was sorry, that he didn't mean what he said, that he couldn't bear the thought of losing me. His voice cracked again, and I realized then how fragile he really was beneath the mask he wore. I leaned into him, my forehead against his, and told him I wasn't going anywhere. That moment bound us even tighter. The fear didn't disappear, the danger didn't fade, but something inside us shifted. We had seen the edge, felt how close we were to losing it all, and yet we still chose each other. The guilt still gnawed at me, the whispers still circled around us, but the love we had was too strong to walk away from. It was wrong in the eyes of the world, forbidden in every sense, but to us, it was the only truth that mattered. And even though we knew the storm was coming, neither of us was willing to let go. The days that followed felt like we were living on a knife's edge, every step threatening to cut us open. The closeness between us had become impossible to disguise, and I could feel the suspicion around us thickening like smoke. Every conversation at the dinner table, every glance from a relative, every offhand remark about how inseparable we were, it all weighed down on me, pushing the fear deeper into my chest. But at the same time, I couldn't bring myself to stop. I was drawn to him with a pull I couldn't resist, no matter how dangerous it became. When he smiled at me from across a crowded room, when his hand brushed mine in secret, when his voice dropped low just for me, the world outside disappeared, and nothing else mattered. It was like living in two realities at once, one where we pretended to be cousins, normal, harmless, and another where we burned in the secret world we had built, a world that only we understood, but pretending was getting harder. He wasn't hiding it as well anymore. His touches lingered longer, his words held double meanings that made me nervous when others were around. Sometimes, he would look at me with such raw intensity that I swore the entire room could see what passed between us. I would shift uncomfortably, trying to mask the truth, but he never seemed to care. One night, while everyone was gathered in the living room, laughing over an old story, his hand brushed against mine beneath the blanket we shared. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure someone would hear, yet he sat there with a calm expression, his thumb stroking my knuckles in a gesture that felt both intimate and reckless. It was moments like that when I realized he wasn't afraid anymore. Or maybe he was, but his desire was stronger than his fear. The tension built to a breaking point one evening when we found ourselves alone again. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that pressed heavily against the walls. He closed the door behind us, and before I could even speak, his lips were on mine, urgent and demanding. His hands gripped my face like he was afraid I would disappear, and the kiss was filled with desperation, like he was pouring every ounce of fear and longing into me. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet, his voice raw as he whispered that he didn't know how much longer he could keep this hidden. He said he wanted me in ways that went beyond stolen touches and secret nights, that pretending we were nothing more than cousins was killing him inside. Hearing those words both terrified and thrilled me, because it was exactly what I felt too but had been too afraid to say. That I admitted it then, my voice shaking, that I wanted more too. That I hated living in shadows, hated the lies, hated the way my heart seized with fear every time someone looked at us too closely. For a moment, the room was thick with silence, both of us staring at each other, realizing how far we had come and how deep we had fallen. And then he pulled me into his arms, holding me so tightly I could barely breathe, whispering that no matter what happened, he wouldn't let anyone take this away from us. But the world outside our bubble was closing in. The whispers around the family grew sharper, no longer just playful jokes but edged with suspicion. I overheard someone late at night questioning why we spent so much time together, why he hadn't shown interest in anyone else. Their tone was cautious, but it was enough to make my stomach drop. I knew the storm was building, and I could feel the cracks forming in the walls we had built to protect ourselves. Yet when I tried to talk to him about being more careful, he shook his head stubbornly, saying he didn't want to waste his life living in fear. He told me that what we had was real, more real than anything else in his world, and he refused to let shame dictate how he lived. That defiance scared me, but it also pulled me closer. His bravery lit something in me, something that made me want to stop hiding too. There was a night when we sat together on the porch, the cool air wrapping around us, the stars bright above. He leaned against me, his shoulder pressing into mine, and whispered that maybe love was always meant to be complicated, that maybe the rules we were breaking weren't as important as the truth we felt. His words sank into me like a weight, but instead of crushing me, they grounded me. For the first time, I stopped thinking about what others would say, and I thought only about how he made me feel, alive, whole, seen. Still, the fear never fully left. Every door creak, every glance, every pause in conversation felt like a warning. I carried the anxiety in my chest like a secret burden, one that I couldn't share with anyone but him. And yet, even with the fear, even with the risk, I couldn't let him go. Because when we were together, when his arms wrapped around me, when his voice dropped to a whisper just for me, I knew I had found something I would never find again. Something worth the danger, worth the whispers, worth the storm that was surely coming. Our love was no longer just a secret, it had become a defiance, a choice we made over and over again despite the risks. And as the world around us edged closer to the truth, I realized there was no turning back. Whatever came next, whatever we had to face, we would face it together. Because even if it destroyed us, even if it burned everything else to the ground, this love was the only thing that made life feel real. And I was willing to pay whatever price it demanded. The truth did not come crashing down in one dramatic moment like I had always feared. It came slowly, creeping in like a storm that had been gathering for weeks until there was no way to ignore it anymore. The questions that once sounded like harmless teasing turned into sharp suspicions. Family members started watching us more closely, their eyes following us when we slipped away, their words heavy with unspoken meaning. It was no longer safe to believe we were invisible, and yet we kept holding on, clinging to each other even as the walls around us began to collapse. The tension between hiding and wanting to be seen became unbearable. Every stolen glance felt like a confession, every touch like a declaration, and the weight of secrecy pressed down so hard it felt like it would suffocate us both. One night it all came to a breaking point. We had slipped into his room again, needing the comfort of each other, desperate for the safety we could only find in our closeness. But the door wasn't locked. In the middle of our whispered words and quiet touches, it opened suddenly, and the look on the face that met ours froze us both in place. It was one of our relatives, someone who had already been suspicious, and the shock in their eyes was undeniable. For a second, the world went silent. Then came the sound of their voice, trembling, angry, confused, demanding to know what we thought we were doing. My body went cold, my chest tight, but he didn't let go of me right away. His hand lingered on mine for one last second before we tore apart, the moment shattered into pieces. The days that followed were chaos. Whispers turned into confrontations, hushed voices behind closed doors, and long silences at the dinner table where nobody could look at us the same way anymore. Some relatives lashed out, calling it wrong, demanding explanations, while others avoided us altogether, pretending nothing had happened. I felt shame like I had never known before, shame that clawed at me and made me want to disappear. But through it all, he refused to back down. He stood taller, his voice steady, his eyes defiant whenever the subject came up. He told me in private that he didn't care what they thought, that he wouldn't let them tear us apart. And though I was terrified, though part of me wanted to run from the fire we had started, I found myself leaning into his strength, holding on to the love that had brought us here in the first place. There were moments when it felt like we wouldn't survive it. Nights when I lay awake, listening to the silence of the house, wondering if tomorrow would be the day I would lose him for good. Arguments flared between us two, born from fear and exhaustion. I would beg him to stay quiet, to let things cool down, while he would insist that hiding was no longer an option. He wanted to live in truth, even if it meant facing the anger and rejection that surrounded us. I envied his courage, but it also scared me. I had always believed love was meant to be gentle, safe, but ours had become a battlefield, and I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to keep fighting, and yet, even in the darkest moments, there were glimmers of something unbreakable. I remember one night when everything felt too heavy, when I couldn't stop crying, the shame and fear crashing over me until I thought I would drown in it. He came to me quietly, sitting beside me without a word. He didn't try to fix it, didn't try to tell me everything would be okay. He just wrapped his arms around me, holding me against his chest, and whispered over and over that he loved me, that nothing in the world could change that. It was in that moment that I realized something important. Love was not always about being fearless. Sometimes love was about being terrified together, about standing side by side even when the world tried to tear you apart. Time did not heal everything, but it changed things. The shock faded into an uneasy silence, the whispers softened into tired acceptance. Not everyone came around, but some did. A few relatives, ones I never expected, quietly offered their support, reminding us that love in any form was still love. It wasn't a happy ending wrapped in a neat bow, but it was something real, something we could live with. And as the dust settled, I realized that the secret we had once fought so hard to hide had become something else entirely. It had exploded, yes, but in the wreckage, there was space to breathe, to grow, to exist without the crushing weight of denial. When I look back now, I don't just see the fear, the shame, the risk. I see the moments of courage, the nights where our whispers carried more truth than any shouted words could. I see the way he looked at me when the world was falling apart, his eyes steady, his hand reaching for mine, choosing me again and again despite everything. And I see the love that burned so fiercely it refused to be hidden, a love that survived even when it should have broken under the weight of its own secrecy that we were not perfect. Our love was not simple. But it was real. And sometimes, that is enough. Because in the end, when everything else fades, the only thing that matters is the truth of what you feel, and the courage to hold on to it, no matter the cost. And though the world may never fully understand us, I know this, I would choose him again, every single time. Even in the face of fear. Even in the face of fire. Always.